Hello, and welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with Phantom. If I had not made the decision when I did, I would have been arrested in the first week of the siege when spy mania swept the city. Anyone who, in dress or manner, betrayed even the slightest difference from their fellow men was denounced to the new Republican authorities as a suspected traitor. The deaf and dumb were hounded without mercy, and even a stammer was sufficient to justify the spiteful persecution of an angry mob. A score of infantrymen who had fled from the enemy of Korobevoi were parading around the city with their hands tied behind their backs, bearing placards that invited honest folk to spit in their faces. The hysteria passed, his spirits lifted, and Paris settled back to enjoy the novelty of a siege that no one expected to last very long. Viewing the fortifications became a pleasant family outing on Sunday afternoons, and while the regiments drilled, the benches in the Champs-Élysées were full of gossiping citizens lolling in the sun. Guitars twanged, organs were ground, and merry-go-rounds were in full swing. People took opera glasses to study the Prussian batteries in Moudon, and the occasional puff of smoke from the gunboats were dismissed with light-hearted derision. Everyone knew that Paris was invincible, with her ancient wall, her 10-foot moat, and her lines of forts stretching over a circumference of 40 miles. She presented a formidable front to any investing army. And the new government had not been idle. The catacombs had been sealed, elaborate barricades placed across the Seine. Electrically fired landmines landed in weak spots. Paris was ready to face the worst that Moltke's vast army was prepared to offer, and the papers predicted that Prussians would soon be sneaking home in humiliating defeat. 4 months later, when the shelling of civilian areas began, the city had been crippled by a harsh winter of increasing deprivation. The temperature had plummeted 12 degrees below zero. Men froze to death on duty at the outposts, and with the city's stocks of firewood virtually exhausted, desperate men and women fought over trees, felled telegraph poles, and threatened to flay the National Guard, which stood on duty outside a wood depot in Rue des Belles Folies. With the Prussian installed at Versailles, Paris starved beneath a merciless iron-gray sky. The left bank of the city shuddered each night beneath a rain of shells which set the streets on fire. From the roof of the opera house, I saw columns of smoke rising in the still, cold air beyond the Seine. The Prussians were deliberately directing their fire at churches and hospitals, and as the batteries closed in around the city, any building flying across the Red Cross of the Geneva Convention was automatically singled as a target. The Institute for the Insane, the Asylum for the Blind, the Hospital for Young Children, nothing was sacred anymore. I found it hard to believe men could sink so low. The opera had been requisitioned as an arsenal and a warehouse for vital food supplies, and I lived in perpetual terror of fire breaking out through someone's carelessness. 1 million liters of wine stood on the premise, and more than once I heard drunken carousing echoing throughout the building. The Prussian batteries were not yet enough to shell the right man, but a single carelessly dropped cigarette was all it took to blow the opera's gunpowder magazine sky high. All the time that I worked alone in my secret house, my heart was full of dread. I never left the premise unguarded, except for a few hours it took me once a fortnight to make my way to Jules' rented gardens on the left bank, and there, in a dark, curtained room, pay the wages of men who would otherwise have starved for want of employment. All over the city had been turned off government sites for the duration of days, duration of the siege. The opera, the new Hôtel Dieu, the 2,000 unfinished houses in the area of Haussmann's redevelopment. I continued to pay my men in my employ without begrudging the few francs they might have managed to earn elsewhere in the meantime. Food was rapidly becoming a prerogative of the rich, but no one who had worked for me at the opera was permitted to starve. When prices soared beyond their mean, I simply raised their due to the level of a living wage. I never looked at the men when they came to the room. I stood with my arms beneath the cloak and my face to the wall while they collected their envelopes in terrified silence and crept away. For the duration of my presence in the house, Madame Bernard and her little ones cowered out of sight in a bedroom. It was still possible to obtain morphine to return for an exorbitant sum and a great deal of patience. I always took care to pay Jules rather more than I owed him for this singular service, then leave without further delay. The ritual depressed me, made me long to get away from that atmosphere of suppressed fear. It was better to be alone. By the 17th week of the siege, Paris was on its knees. The butcher's stall in the great central market were selling slaughtered cats decorated with paper frills and colored ribbons. And the rat market on the Place de la Hôtel de Ville was besieged with desperate customers. The animals in the zoo at the Bois had been slaughtered so that restaurants might serve elephants to those with the means to pay for the delicacy. Someone would have almost certainly eaten Aisha if I hadn't found her first. I was wandering the streets aimlessly at night, listening with indifference to the shells whining overhead like the howling of a high wind in autumn. There was no one around. Anyone with any sense in the area was lying low in a cellar out of harm's way. But I no longer cared whether I was blown to pieces by a Prussian bomb. A telling little incident at the Bernard house had virtually dulled the last of my fading appetite for life. All the men had gone. I had been settling up with Jules, and there was a scream in the hallway and the sound of something tumbling heavily down the stairs. Without thinking, I ran into the narrow, ill-lit passage just as Madame Bernard reached the bottom step and snatched up the small child who was whimpering at my feet. Clutching the little girl against her breast, she began to back away from the stairs. "Madame, the child is injured. Look at her." No," she stammered, still edging up the stairs. No, Mr. University, it was nothing. Just a little tumble. 2 or 3 steps, that's all. That's all." She was lying. The child had fallen down a full flight and now lay white and unprotesting in her arms. I started up the stairs and was frozen by the woman's shriek of fear. "Stay away from her. Don't touch her." "Madame, why do you come here?" she spat, suddenly veering from terror to aggression. "Frightening children, frightening everyone. Why don't you keep away?" "Annette!" Jules grasped in horror. "Manette, for God's sake, be silent. We don't need your cold charity," she continued doggedly from the landing. "We don't need your money. You won't buy my children as you bought my husband. Go away, monsieur. Go right away and never come back. Do you hear me? Don't come back here again." She turned and ran into the landing, and once a door slammed behind her on a room of crying children. I came back slowly down the stairs where Jules was waiting with both hands clutched against his thin chest. "Monsieur," he whispered helplessly, "Monsieur, I beg you to forgive my wife's outburst. She's not in her right senses. She meant no offense." I silenced him with a look and tossed him 200 francs onto the shabby hall table. Get the child to a doctor quickly," I said coldly, and walked out of the house. My heart was like a lump of lead dragging heavily in my breast as I made my way back to the squalid, snow-laden streets. On the bank of the Seine, as I passed the study, the ice floes that were blocking the river, I heard a prostitute hailing a passing soldier. "Monsieur, I will take you to my room in exchange for a piece of bread." The man paused and spoke, but I could not hear his reply. Presently they moved on together in the direction of the Rue de Grenelle. Staring out across the frozen river, I wondered briefly just how hungry a woman would have been to accept bread from my hand in return for her services. I never dared to approach a prostitute. I'd never been able to face the humiliation of having my money refused. The memory of that slave girl in Persia still burned in my mind. Something pulled at the hem of my cloak, and as I turned thinking to find the elephant cashmere snagged on the reins of a palig, I found that I too had been accosted by a lady desperate for food. A very little lady. There, on the pavement, almost indistinguishable against the dreary snow, a cream kitten sat with her claws of her chocolate-covered paws entangled in the material. There, on the pavement, with a cry of disbelieving delight, I swept her off the snow and examined her beneath the yellowish light of a gas lamp. She was caked with filth, but her breed was as unmistakable as it was inconceivable. There were no Siamese cats in Europe, and yet I held one in my hand, a rare and precious jewel dropped from heaven into the landscape of hell. Of course, I knew she could not possibly have dropped from heaven. Some enterprising French traveler had evidently succeeded in smuggling a breeding female from the palace of Bangkok, knowing that the Empress Eugenie would be prepared to pay handsomely for such a unique animal. Everywhere, rich ladies would be clamoring for a similar novelty, but no doubt the man had expected to make a fortune. But the Empress had fled, and their rich were now eating their fine-blooded racehorses. Ugh. No one was interested in acquiring another mouth, only in that little extra something for the cooking pot. Dead cats had become a fashionable substitute for flowers, and sweets as a gift for a sick friend. Boiled cat served with pistachio nuts and olives had become a delicacy for connoisseurs. Ugh. I could well imagine in the horrible end which had overtaken the mother and the rest of her litter. This little creature was born to survive. I could see it in the irrepressible impishness of her crossed blue eyes. Fate, which favors against the longest odds, had brought her soliciting to a man who would have died of hunger before he separated her from her lovely whelp. Tucking her safety beneath my cloak, I suffered through the streets with fresh purpose in my step. Aisha had changed my life. Over 50,000 kilos of salted horse meat had been stored at the opera, and supplies were not entirely exhausted. I could not bring myself to consume horse flesh, but I stole for Aisha and stayed out of the room while she aided to control my revulsion. There were plenty of rats in the cellars, and within a few weeks she had lost the scraggliness of starvation and grown sleek and contented. She followed me around the secret house like a puppy and sat beside me while I worked. I could not wait for the day when she would be big enough to wear the Persian collar. To see her strutting in its stolen magnificence would be a pleasure beyond imagination. She would be my amusement, my joy, the chosen companion of my solitude. If there had been no horse meat and rats, she would have eaten human flesh. I would have killed, if necessary, to feed my precious little lady. 19 weeks into the siege, the beleaguered government catapulted in awesome resentful silence descended like a shroud around the city. The German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées, and in their wake the poor, who had borne the brunt of all the hardships, were summarily required by a reactionary assembly to pay all debts and rents postponed for the duration of the siege. Within 48 hours, plunged into bankruptcy, incensed by immediate suppression of 6 newspapers, the lower classes rose in fury, and a new revolution rocked the city. The revolution fled to Versailles. The Commune of Paris was declared, and as the screaming mobs took to the streets, the real horrors began. No longer was the madness of destruction confined to the left bank. The opera was seized by the National Guard, and the red flag of the Commune, which now flew from the roof, made the building a perfect target for the Republican forces. More bombs screamed down to the battered city, but now they were on French shells, the shells of the Civil War. Soldiers swarmed all over the barricaded opera house, and there was a vicious fighting in the streets outside. I had become a prisoner in my own home. To all intents and purposes, I was under house arrest, for I knew that if I showed myself, I would be shot on sight as a spy. Down into the cellars came the citizen generals with their pistols and their ridiculous red sashes, their cigarettes glowing in the darkness like tiny embers as they supervised the incarnation of political prisoners. The perfect silence was punctuated by their crude oaths and raucous laughter. I hate these cruel intruders, shepherding their victims down to the communal dungeon down the fifth cellar. I hated them all. National Guardsmen and all the Republicans alike. Fools! Ignorant fools! How dare they violate my sanctuary with their filthy, destructive war? How dare they imprison me like this? 5 weeks it lasted, but it seemed like 5 years before the communards fell to the Republican forces in a savage barrage of hell's flames, massacring hostages and setting fire to state monuments as they abandoned their positions. In their wake, the Hôtel de Ville and the Palace of the Tuileries were left black and smoldering ruins. Once more, like the streets of Paris were burning. Since the opera had been used as a field hospital for communard troops, it had been so far escaped their relentless arson. But one evening, at the height of the crisis, I was driven home from the house on the lake by a terrible presentiment of doom. Careless of discovery, I began to comb the vaults like a demented bloodhound. And there in the third cellar I found a member of the National Guard laying in the fuses that would have connected with a dozen barrels of gunpowder. "Are you acting upon orders from your commanding officer?" I demanded stonily. The man spun around in alarm, drawing his pistol upon me, and took aim. "Are you acting upon orders?" I repeated with grim insistence. "Have you been told to do this?" "No," he laughed suddenly, his eyes widened and staring with a blind lust that suddenly was recognizable to me. "This place has been forgotten by generals, but not by me. Not by me. I'm going to blow this filthy imperialist abomination off the face of the earth. But I'll settle with you first, my interfering friend." The Punjab lasso silenced him before he got the chance to pull the trigger, and I dragged his body onto the street where darkness fell, leaving it with others likewise abandoned. Then I went back to the gunpowder. Patiently, I ferried the barrels across the lake and stored them in my own cellar with a strange secret pleasure. I had sunk my life and livelihood into this splendid monument, nursed it from pulling infancy, and caressed its beautiful stone and marble body like a fond lover. The National Academy of Music was mine, and I reserved exclusive rights to its destruction. If the day ever came when this precious edifice should be razed to a pile of dust and rubble, it would be my hand that lit the fuse, mine alone. Those tense, uneasy weeks of intrusion and unforgivable violation showed me the ruthless measures I must now take to secure my retreat from the rest of mankind. To my original design, I added a torture chamber, an exact replica of the hexagonal mirror chamber I had once built for the Khanum. It was nothing more or less than a simple man-trap. No interfering busybody who had found his way in over his head would find a way out again except through suicide. Sitting beneath the sub-stage area, with a trapdoor affording access to the third cellar, it was also a useful shock to my house. There were more than 6,000 steps in the opera, and most of them led down. A shortcut would not come across under conditions. Beneath the subterranean waters, I laid the cable which permitted a simple electric bell to give ample warning of intruders in the lake. And so, my labyrinth was wide for death, a vast web encircling the Minotaur's secret lair. That foolish, unsuspecting man trapped with care in the maze of my creation. All roads do not lead to Rome. And that's it for that chapter. Thank you. I'll see you later.